At 16, I left my mom's house and moved with him.
And did he make you go to school?
Growing up, right?
What you mean when you say from my...
Well, you were around the house, you saw what was going on at that house quite a bit, right?
Yeah, when I was around the house, I was kind of young, so I can't say like they got what was expected or whatever, so I can't speak on it.
From what you saw, they always had clothes, they always had food.
Yes, like I said, sometimes.
Okay. Defendant's mother was always around, right?
No, she wasn't always around.
She was there giving them love when she was there, right?
When she was there.
Thank you, sir.
No further questions. Hold on.
All right.
No further questions.
Thank you, sir. You're free to go.
All right.
Yeah. Right in the middle, sir.
Call your next witness.
Dr. Sesta?
This way, sir. I have a seat right here. Thank you.
May I inquire?
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you introduce yourself to the jury?
Morning, I'm Joseph John Sesta.
And how are you employed?
Here in Florida, I'm a board-certified forensic neuropsychologist. In Louisiana, I'm licensed to practice medicine as an advanced practice medical psychologist.
And what does a neuropsychologist do?
Neuropsychologist is a PhD in neurosciences who examines brain function. Particularly, we look at any evidence of injury or disease or developmental disability to the brain and how that may affect thinking, emotion, and behavior.
And how do you do that?
It's a day-long examination. I start out by doing the physical exam of the patient. I look at their cranial nerves, the muscles of their head and face. I look at their motor function and coordination, how well they move. I look at their sensory and perceptual functioning, their eyes, ears, nose, etc. I check their reflexes. I then run through a mental status examination, look at their thinking. I brought two female doctors, I have two postdoctoral fellowships in my practice for young doctors who want to be board certified. So I had my first and my second year fellow with me, Mr. Loyd, examining his brain function, everything to how fast he can move his fingers, to the strength in his hands, to his intelligence, his memory, his executive or higher order functions like reasoning and judgment. And then we did a psychiatric examination to determine if there was any symptoms of psychosis or other psychiatric illness that was relevant.
Okay, doctor, I want to talk about your practice in the field before we get into the details of this. Now, you are a neuropsychologist.
Yeah.
Okay. And you as a neuropsychologist go one step beyond that and do actual testing, and are you board certified?
I am actually quadruple board certified. I am board certified in adult neuropsychology by the American Board of Professional Neuropsychology. I'm board certified in pediatric neuropsychology by the American Board of Pediatric Neuropsychology. I'm board certified in medical psychology by the American Board of Medical Psychology. And then I have subspecialty certification in forensic neuropsychology, which is the application of neuroscience to legal proceedings such as this.
And as a psychologist, could you be board certified in Florida?
Any psychologist can be board eligible if they go to school for 2 more years. They're required to do at least 2 years of postdoctoral training in a specialty. That's what my fellows are doing with me. And then after 2 years, they're what's called board eligible, which means they have the training to pursue peer review and board certification. Doesn't guarantee that they will. The second step is they take a written examination in their specialty, not in psychology, which is general practice, but they take a written examination in the specialty of neuropsychology. If they pass that, they have the all-critical stage, the work sample review. To be honest, it's not a hard thing to talk to lay people about a specialty when you don't know anything, but when you have to present your work to doctors around the country who are experts in your field, you have to do that and pass the work sample. Then you come in orally and you face 3 doctors who are board certified, and they examine you on your work, on your training, on anything they want to for 3 hours. So 3 hours, 3 doctors, all who board certified. If you pass all 4 stages, you can represent yourself to the public as being board certified in a particular specialty, and that's often called peer review and board certified. It basically means that your experts recognize you as an expert.
Now, in the course of your duties here, were you provided with the deposition of an individual by the name of Dr. Pritchard?
I was.
You knew Dr. Pritchard?
Yeah, Dr. Pritchard and I have been friends and colleagues for about 25 years.
Okay. And you're aware that Dr. Pritchard is the state's doctor that was hired by the state of Florida a couple years ago?
I am.
Is Dr. Pritchard board certified as a psychologist?
No.
And we're going to talk more about your opinions about Dr. Pritchard's opinion a little later. Now, what materials did you review in this particular case?
I began, they gave me school records from the Orange County school system. I reviewed those. And then I was later presented with about a little over 300 pages of records from Orlando Regional Medical Center. And then I had police reports from, they were titled from a Detective Savelli, but they were essentially the police reports regarding what we call the instant offense, what happened in this case.
Is it unusual in the course of the work that you do when you're dealing with individuals who are in their 30s, 40s, sometimes even 20s, that records from events in their life have been destroyed and are unable to locate?
Sure. In the state of Florida, like in my practice, we only have to keep full records for 4 years. We only have to keep a summary of those records for 3 more. After 7 years, we can purge or destroy all records. And we do that because, to be honest, I would have to rent a warehouse if I didn't do that. So every 7 years, we purge all records. That's very common.
Okay, so would you be surprised if there were no records of, for instance, the hospitalization of Mr. Loyd at Laurel Oaks, which you were given some information about?
No, those were very old cases. I'd be shocked if any hospital would hold on to records that long.
Okay. So besides the materials you reviewed, what do you do next?
Next, I traveled over here to Orlando with my 2 postdocs, and we went to the jail, and we examined Mr. Loyd for the whole day, as I described. My part takes about 2 hours. Then it's a good thing about being old, you get to get in, get out. But then my 2 postdocs spent the rest of the day with Mr. Loyd doing all of the testing that I described, IQ, neuropsych, psych testing, and they wrapped up, I think, by about almost 5 o'clock and came on back to Tampa.
And did you or your post-ops take a history of Mr. Loyd?
Yes, we did. We took medical history, psychiatric history, social history, and then a brief criminal history.
Now, did you determine whether he had a history of head injuries?
He does. He has a lot of head injuries. Just to be brief, he had 1 head injury about age 13, where he was on the base, a military base, and then he got beat up with a pool stick or something, and they found him wandering incoherent around the base and took him into the hospital. So that was 1. Later on, he was defending his sister, and 3 boys beat him fairly severely. He had that head injury. Then he was kidnapped at that age 16, apparently held captive for about 4 hours, and according to him, that when he got loose or escaped, or however he came to be separated from them, he looked like the Elephant Man. He was beaten so badly. And then he had a lot of football injuries. He was, as Mr. Loyd, as you see, is a big gentleman, and he apparently was a very good football player, hit very hard, but apparently he had, as we know now, these concussive injuries that come from football, which back when I used to play in the 80s, they just say shake it off, but now we know that that may not be a good thing. And then finally he had a physical altercation, he said, with his son at age 42, which rendered him unconscious. So he certainly had nothing severe, like no hemorrhages or anything, no penetrating missile injuries or gunshot wounds, but he certainly had we call closed head injuries or concussion injuries to the brain.
Now, did you determine in the history that he had some learning disability issues?
Yes, he had a lot of difficulty in school, a lot of failures, apparently a history of special education needs, and that led him to be retained in some grades and then require special education.
Now, tell us what the examinations that you did and the testing that you did before we get to the MMPI. Let's talk about the neuropsych testing.
Sure, and I'll be pretty brief with this. There's over 50 tests. There's no reason to go over each one. Essentially, we look at IQ. One of the things that we look at, particularly in death penalty cases, is there any evidence of mental retardation? There isn't. Mr. Loyd has an IQ of 89, which is in the low average range in our population, so there was no evidence that he suffered from any intellectual disability. And all other domains, there was nothing in the abnormal range. The only thing we saw, we can do an intra-individual comparison. We look at you two ways. How do you compare to the population? And then how do you compare to yourself? We can look at, so compared to the population, he's fine. Everything's in the low average to average range. There's no abnormalities. Compared to himself, an intra-individual pattern, his verbal reasoning was statistically different from all of his other brain abilities. It's still in the low average range, but it's an area we call relative weakness for him, and that's consistent with his history of what we think is a verbal learning disability. So that's consistent with the educational history. Other than that, I don't see any sequelae or after effects of any neurological trauma. So when all those head injuries we talked about, either he was lucky and they didn't do anything, or they did something and he recovered, and to the point that I can't detect any residual effects of neurological trauma at this point. I don't see any evidence of neurological disease. Of course, he's a young man. He's too young for dementia, but I don't see any evidence of any neurological diseases either.
Okay. Now, doctor, there's a difference between intelligence, IQ, and functioning versus mental illness. Are those two distinct, different things?
Sure. I've examined, I was a professor, I've had students in my class who've had schizophrenia and bipolar disorder who are extremely bright. So just because you have a mental illness certainly doesn't mean that you're intellectually impaired. So they're two quite different things. So Mr. Loyd doesn't have any problems intellectually, which is not to say he doesn't have problems psychiatrically.
Okay, we're going to talk about that. But before we get to that, I want to talk to you about the MMPI. Is that the test you administered to Mr. Loyd?
The MMPI-2-RF, which is the most recent iteration. The MMPI came out in the late 1930s. It's the most commonly administered psychological test, not just in the United States, but in the world. It's been translated into several languages. When I was a civilian doctor with the U.S. military, we used it in the military. We've used it in court systems. We use it for job selection. So it's the most commonly administered psych test in the world.
Okay. And I'd like to take some time to explain it to the jury. Would it assist you, doctor, for you to step down and have the whiteboard so you can explain this to the jury?
Is there anything on it? I mean, do we have the MMPI profile?
It's a blank board. I'm going to give...
No, I'm fine then.
You're good?
Yeah, I'm fine if there's nothing on it. And I can talk to him about it.
Okay.
Yes.
So why don't you step down and talk to him?
Okay.
Come on.
All right.
Yeah, do you want to use the whiteboard? Okay. I was a little confused at what you were telling me. Can I have a marker? Thank you. Doctor, have you taught before?
Yeah, I was a full professor over in Chicago.
quality of that and things like that.
Okay. So let's start off, and what is the most important thing that the jury needs to understand about this test that you gave to Mr. Loyd?
Oh, great. Didn't tell me how to juggle so many things in 2 hands this morning. Well, the most important thing to remember is that this is a good way to tease out malingering. Okay, when I'm in
What is malingering?
Sure.
Because remember, we all are not
Sure.
have a background in psychology. So what is malingering?
Here's your fancy word for the day. It means faking, okay? And we don't usually worry about that too much in my medical practice in Louisiana. I mean, folks come in, and I say, how can I help you? And usually it's what I call the terrible tetrad: depression, anxiety, insomnia, and pain. And they usually tell me they have one of those 4 things, and they want me to prescribe them medication before they leave. And typically speaking, they're not faking. Psychiatric medications generally aren't fun to take, so I'm not really worried about them faking. Now, in a forensic case, such as there's 2 civil cases, folks want money. In criminal cases, folks are in trouble and hoping to get out of trouble with the law. So the reasonable forensic doctor is always open to the idea that person's faking. An idea, and the goal would be to get out of trouble. So in this case, immediately, as I mentioned, I'm talking to him, Mr. Loyd starts telling me about some unusual thought processes. He thinks he's targeted because he's essentially not a big pop culture person, but the movie The Matrix or something, so he's like this being in The Matrix where he's on a different plane, so people are more aware of him, so he gets targeted and arrested more often than others, and he used to run the entire city of Orlando, and real quickly I'm thinking, these are odd or unusual thoughts. Unlike psychiatry, and I think we have a psychiatrist later, I don't see the person a whole bunch of times in these cases. So my idea is, quickly and scientifically, how do I tease out for the jury, 1, is he faking? And then 2, if he's not faking, what's actually going on with him thought-wise? So
Let me stop you there for a second, so it's clear. In the criminal system, when people are facing prison time, the death penalty, civil cases where people want money, many times you will run into situations where people exaggerate or are untruthful about what they're hearing. They're hearing voices, they're seeing things like that, right?
Right, that's called fake bad. The opposite for like child custody cases and police and fitness for duty cases is fake good. The person who tells you, I never get angry, I've never had diarrhea, I've never had a thought I shouldn't tell anyone about. They basically want to fake good to put themselves in an unrealistically good light. So we see that in types of cases. Fake bad is the opposite, as the attorney described to you. So I hear voices, I hear this, I have crazy thoughts, etc. So they can fake good or they can fake bad.
Okay. And besides the MMPI-2, are there other tests that you could use or a psychologist could use to determine whether someone's suffering from a mental illness?
Sure. There's 2 others that we teach our students. They're not as old as the MMPI. One is the PAI, the Personality Assessment Inventory. As the name would suggest, it's a personality test. And the other one is the MCMI, the Milan Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory. Kind of a nice test. The MCMI lines up with the diagnostic manual for personality disorders. So if someone was going to tell you, hey, I think this person has a personality disorder, you might want to say, show me the evidence. And one thing that my students and my postdocs who are sitting in the courtroom know, if you're going to use the word clinical to me, in my clinical opinion, I'm going to do this, actually on a board. All right, clinical equals I have no data. Okay, so both reliable and valid. Before we even get into what a test is talking about, we look at reliable simply means, can you measure the same thing twice? When I get up in the morning, I step on my bathroom scale, I look at it, kind of frown a little bit, but let's say it says 180. I step off my bathroom scale, I step back on. If it says 190, and I step off one more time, step back on, it says 155, how much do I weigh? You don't know, okay? So the instrument is not a reliable instrument. Reliability simply means consistency. Can you measure the same thing twice? So the first thing we look at in someone's responses is are they responding consistently? There's 338 items on this test. Some of them are repeated. Some ask you about the same things in different ways, almost like a police interrogation coming back, and they look at, do you respond consistently? Sometimes we get kids who, with their Christmas tree, they'll just go down, true, false, true, false, true, false. They're not even reading the items. The computer will very quickly pick up that you're responding inconsistently. So the first thing we look at is, do we have a consistent pattern of responses? And we did. I'm just going to write consistency here and put a check mark. So we know that when Mr. Loyd took the test, he was reading and attending to all of the items, and he was responding in a consistent way.
Okay, I want to stop you there for a second. Now, you're aware Dr. Pritchard met with Mr. Loyd
Yes.
last week. And you're aware that he knew about your testing, but did not do any of his own testing. You're aware of that?
That's true.
Okay, that's from the deposition?
Yes.
Okay. So the jury understands when you're dealing with the words objective and subjective as a scientist, which test is this?
This is an objective test, which means it's been normed on several thousand people in the United States population. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the computer. This is actually nice, unlike the old days when we had bubble sheets. The computer does everything. He enters his responses right into the computer, and the computer scores it instantaneously. So there's a So there's a 0% chance of scoring error because the computer scores everything. What we do then is we compare Mr. Loyd's responses to a large group of Americans who do not suffer from any mental illnesses, mental diseases, or basically psychiatric problems. And we look at how does he do compared to that. It's called a normative group. How does he do compared to the normative group? Is he above or below?
Okay. So would you agree that this particular test is the best evidence that you have in your evaluation to determine his mental illness?
Absolutely. Again, the MMPI is the oldest and most well-researched, psychiatric test in the United States.
Okay. So let's go through the testing process, what you did. I want you to talk about the malingering issues and how the test works to ferret out malingering. And malingering is when someone's trying to fake it, validity, okay? I want you to explain that, and I want you to explain how Mr. Loyd did in regards to that issue.
Sure. So this is kind of how I walk my students through it too. So we already talked about consistency. There are some measures of consistency. It's the first thing we look at. If the data is inconsistent, the test is garbage. Okay, we throw it out. But it wasn't. So he has consistent responses. The next thing we can look at is validity. Remember my scale analogy? And if you're young and you have the digital scales, you won't get this, but if you're old, you remember the scales where you had to dial them to 0? You can sit down and you change the scale, so you put the little sting at 0 every time. Well, let's suppose you back that scale up to 20 pounds. So now you step on it. You can step on it 3 times. It gives you the same weight, but you set it back 20 pounds.
Doctor, you just have to slow down a little because the court reporter
I'm sorry.
fingers are smoking.
I'm sorry. So that's what validity is. So even though you stepped on that scale 3 times, you got the same weight 3 times, it's not valid because you set the scale back 20 pounds. So validity is, now that we know that he's responding consistently, do the responses he gives accurately represent his mental state, or is he trying to fake good, or is he trying to fake bad?
So how does the test determine that?
They ask you a number of questions. I'm not allowed to, obviously, for my contracts with the test publishers, I can't give you the test question.
I want to stop you there for a second so we can explain that to the jury. Whenever you do this testing, you're not even allowed to give me the data. Is that right, as his lawyer?
Right. It can only transfer doctor to doctor, because obviously if this gets out on YouTube or gets out on the internet, then either attorneys who are trying to throw a case one way or the other would say, hey, listen, here's the questions you're going to get asked. When you get asked these questions, answer this way. So we very tightly guard the questions to these tests.
Okay, and so what does the rule allow you to do? Who are you allowed to send that data to?
I can go doctor to any licensed psychologist or licensed psychiatrist, and sometimes there's some specialized neurologist but as long as the doctor is ethically able to interpret the data that you send them.
Okay, did there come an occasion in the last week or two where you were asked to send the data to Dr. Pritchard?
Yeah, there was.
Okay. Tell the jury what happened in regards to that issue.
Sure. Well, Greg and I are friends. I sent him an email, like, hey, Greg, it's Joe. I've got the data all copied for you. And the way we do it so it doesn't get lost in the email, it's actually, I think, the new Florida bar rules. We have now a fancy new encrypted email. So I sent him a Gmail with a 10-digit password. I said, here's the email the attorneys gave me. If this is your correct email, just respond back. Here's your password, and then we'll send you the data in this encrypted email, and here's your 10-character password to enter in to decrypt the data. I never got a response from from Dr. Pritchard at all.
Okay, so he never got the data from you?
No, and I think, as I told you guys before, he wouldn't know what to do with it. I mean, I knew he wouldn't want it because he doesn't have any way. There's about a couple $1,000s of equipment you would have to actually reanalyze the data, and I knew he wouldn't be interested in it.
Okay. And did you know whether he was tied up with 2 other cases in the week or 2 preceding this? Do you know anything about that?
No, actually, we haven't testified in court together, so I haven't seen him in quite a while.
Okay. So we were talking about the validity. And so what was the result of the validity in regards to Mr. Loyd's testing?
So there was no evidence of fake bad. Checks me, so he's not faking bad. He's not trying to tell us that that he's exaggerating or fabricating symptoms of mental illness. And he's not faking good either. I mean, he wouldn't have any reason to fake good, so that's obvious, but he's not obviously trying to deny or minimize common human shortcomings or frailties. So the data is valid. So it's consistent. And now we have valid data. So now what we're able to do is talk about what the heck did the test find.
Now, does sometimes people underreport?
Yeah, usually the most common places are child custody examinations when 2 parents are fighting over a child and each wants to look like the best parent, so parents will underreport anything. And then usually law enforcement and fitness for duty examinations where, again, they want to say they're going to obviously give someone a gun and put them on the road. Again, I don't have any psych problems, I don't have any anger problems, I never think bad things, etc.
What about someone who is mentally ill and doesn't want to be recognized as mentally ill?
We've seen that depending on the setting, and we have in Florida the Jimmy Rice Sexually Violent Predator Acts, where the folks are sentenced to basically an indefinite term in a sexual predator facility in Arcadia, and they want out. And the only reason to get out is if they no longer suffer from a mental abnormality. So those cases, and they're kind of quasi, they're not really criminal, they're not really civil, they're in the middle. But those folks often try to fake good because they want to tell the court that, hey, look at me, I'm all fine now, you can let me out.
Okay. And so once you determine the validity, what is the next thing that you look at?
We look at the clinical scales, what's going on with the person, and there's a couple that kind of summarize everything. The one that he elevated was the thought disorder scale.
Okay, what is a clinical scale? Define that for the jury and define how the test is structured so
Sure.
we understand.
Sure. Scales basically look at different types of psychiatric symptoms. So there's scales for depression, there's scales for thought disorder or psychosis, particularly persecutory thought. There's scales for anxiety. So there's a number of clinical scales on the MMPI that you look at if they're elevated. And elevated, I mean, are they so different from the normal population that you say something is wrong?
Okay, and so you said that the thought disorder scale was elevated.
Right, it was significantly elevated. So what this tells us that is, now that we know that someone who's not faking bad and who's responding consistently, that their thought processes, the way they think, are so different from people in the general population that the doctor should seriously consider the likelihood that they suffer from a thought disorder. And the thought disorders are things like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, delusional disorder. Thought disorders are cases where the person's disorder is so bad, they lose contact with reality. Typically, they have delusions. Delusions are false thoughts or beliefs that you hold contrary to logic or cultural norms, and hallucinations. You can see things, hear things that aren't really there.
And so what did this tell you, this scale elevation tell you about Mr. Loyd?
That he very likely suffers from a psychotic thought disorder.
Okay. And where was he in comparison to the norm?
Can I reach my...
Sure.
Not sure I'm going to hold this up here. I'm not sure it's the best visual aid.
So why don't you go ahead and step close to the jury?
Okay.
Oh, let me put that on, Judge. I'm going to start this, if I can have a moment, so the jury can see it. Ted? Yes. Yes. It's in his report. Here. All right, doctor, why don't you step up to your,
Okay.
so you can see it. I don't know if, can he touch the screen? And no? Okay. He can touch the screen?
Yeah, he can touch
Oh,
that.
You
okay.
can touch the screen, doctor. So why don't you go ahead and show them what you're talking about?
Okay, so, sorry, I don't know if I... So that top peak right here, I don't know if, how do I erase what I just did? I think I...
Does he have the pen up there? Is the pen up there?
I don't
There should be a pen for you.
I don't see it, Judge.
Hold on.
There's a clear button there.
There's a clear button. Oh, got it. Got it.
You can clear it.
Yeah, I see it clear.
See the clear?
Perfect.
Okay, there you go.
I don't know if it's responding to my finger. Okay, got it.
There should be a pen up there.
I can go low-tech and just talk it through it instead of using my fingers.
Okay, that's fine. Any way you want, doctor, but
The first, the higher order scales basically summarize all this data to you into just a couple of scales. The middle one is the thought disorder scale. You can just see visually how that big kind of spike or peak there at the score of 84. Just so you know, 50 here is the average score in the U.S., then the standard deviation is 10. If you've ever seen the bell curve, okay, by the time you get past 2 or 3 standard deviations, you're off the curve. So 50's average, then 60, 70, 80, 84. He's already off the bell curve in terms of how far his thinking is from other people in the normative sample. So that's the main take-home message from that scale, is that this is not just someone who has a mild thought disorder, maybe it's subtle. This is someone that it's so elevated that you have to pretty much understand that this is a person with a thought disorder. The following scales tell us, well, what does that thought disorder look like? And you see that huge peak, even higher over there under the thoughts of persecution. This is what's called the ceiling effect. A ceiling effect is when a person scores so high, the test can't go any higher. Okay, there's also a floor effect. When you score so low, you can't go lower. But Mr. Loyd scores so high in his ideas of persecution, the test can't measure it any further. And that, again, is very robust evidence now. So we have one scale telling us, hey, look out, there's a thought disorder. The other scales tell us, well, what does this thought disorder look like? His his big thing is delusions of persecution, essentially that individuals are trying to hurt him or harm him for no objective reason. And that's very, very important to us in a forensic case, because that's often a precipitant to violence. If I think you're going to hurt me, I should defend myself and hurt you before you hurt me. So in this case, that very severe peak in the ideas of persecution is really all that's important from this from this instrument.
And so how is this graft generated?
By the computer. What I also did, if you see the shading there, sometimes we call bulletproofing. Bulletproofing is when you're a forensic doctor and you try to anticipate what the other side's going to ask you on cross. Something that we see oftentimes, and even civil cases too, is, well, doctor, you compared my client to the normative group of people in the United States, but doctor, my client got hit by a car. He's got pain. Well, it's not fair to compare him to a normal group. Why don't you compare him to people who've got pain and tell me if he's as depressed or anxious as people who are in pain? Well, in this case, Mr. Loyd obviously has a unique experience. He's been, housed within a jail I saw him actually Halloween of last year, so I know he's been there at least a year, and I know he was there for about a year or so before that. So for years now, he's been housed inside of a prison, and not a jail, excuse me. And not only that is, he's obviously facing the most severe charges that we have in our society. He's looking at the ultimate punishment, death. Or at least he knew it was possible when he was in jail. So what I did, the bars there, the gray bars are male pretrial defendants, so people who are in jail awaiting criminal charges. They don't go as far as telling us who was there for murder or who was there for rape, but these are people males who are in jail knowing that they're going to face sentencing on criminal charges. So we can see, obviously those people might be more anxious, which you can see what's important. If you look at the thought disorder and our ideas of persecution again, he's even outside, the little dot in the middle of the bar is the average criminal defendant. The bar shows you, even if you go extreme, how far out the most extreme criminal scores. He's even out past the extreme. So one could not make a good argument saying that, he's a criminal, he's in jail, this is just the way criminals who are in jail think. No, it's not. Okay, so the test again definitively establishes that scientifically that what Mr. Loyd is experiencing is far beyond that of the typical male criminal defendant facing sentencing.
All right, doctor. The chart that you have in front of you, less the writing on this. This is from your report and the writing on the back. The chart alone, is that a fair and accurate depiction of the MMPI-2 results for Mr. Loyd?
Yes, this was far beyond my technical skills, but my millennial doctors were able to cut and paste this directly from the MMPI output report and insert it into our report. And don't ask me how they did that, but they did.
I'm going to move to introduce this, which is Exhibit AT. I'm only going to introduce this part. I'll get rid of all of that. Yeah, move in here. Yeah, I'll substitute, Judge. Get a scissoring cut off. I move this into evidence. AT.
Be received without objection, just the graph itself as defense exhibit number 9 for penalty phase purposes.
Was the results that you observed on this testing consistent with your observations?
Yes, as I mentioned, the reason I gave the test is that in speaking with him during the interview, I observed what I thought to be delusions, both grandiose and persecutory delusions, and so the test confirmed what I saw during my interview.
Okay. Could you explain what the DSM is?
The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it's the DSM-5, meaning it's the 5th edition of a book that predates my going to school.
Okay. And can you explain the DSM-5 to the jury, and what does it consist of and what is it used for?
It's simply a checklist of symptoms that constitute different mental disorders, and it'll tell you quite simply on the top, if you think someone has depression or schizophrenia, here's a list of the symptoms they can't have, and they have to have 4 of the 6 of these, or 2 of these, or they have to have this symptom for a certain amount of time, etc. So it's simply the manual that psychiatrists and psychologists use to code mental illnesses.
And did you use that in any way in this particular case?
I did. I used it to diagnose Mr. Loyd.
Okay. And explain to the jury what you did and what your conclusions were.
Sure. In looking at the data that we had and looking at, of course, the book is this thick, but we can kind of jump to the point that we had. I knew he had a thought disorder, so I looked at the psychotic disorders. He doesn't have schizophrenia. He's never really had the hallucinations. He's never really seen things or heard things on a regular basis that others don't. So I didn't think there was a schizophrenic disorder. But he does have these delusions that are kind of isolated, because, I mean, he's not running through the streets of Orlando stark raving mad. He had a job. He was delivering some chicken, and he obviously was a father. He was able to do some things and function in society. So I think, what kind of disorder can someone have this, we call it an encapsulated delusional system, but still function fairly well when you don't enter that sphere of their delusion? And that's actually called a delusional disorder. It's a psychotic disorder, but they can function better than schizophrenics. They don't hallucinate, and as long as you can actually have a reasonably normal conversation with them, as long as you don't enter into the realm of their delusions. If you do, then you're going to end up, basically, they're going to sound crazy to you. So I thought he had a delusional disorder, and then we're asked what type of delusions does he have. You saw that huge spike. He obviously has persecutory delusions. He thinks people are trying to hurt him or harm him when in fact they're not. And he has these grandiose delusions. These delusions that, his self-worth, that he's, sort of worth more than he actually is. He's done some things that are special, and he thinks he's sort of a special person. So he has those two things combined. The persecutory delusions are far worse, but he certainly has this grandiosity as well, and that's what's called a mixed type. So he has a delusional disorder, mixed type.
Okay. And what about paranoia? Where does that fit in?
I didn't see a whole lot of paranoia, but whenever you have grandiosity, you always get an element of paranoia. In other words, if you think that you're so special, that there's something really, really special about you, you're going to wonder, well, what if people who aren't as special as me are out to get me? Or what if someone's jealous of my special skills? So whenever it's hard to have grandiosity without some element of paranoia.
Okay, let's talk about those delusions. Are those delusions something that are existing every waking hour that he's awake?
Very unlikely. That's actually a faking question. Mentally ill patients who tell you that their symptoms are unrelenting are very unlikely to be telling the truth. Typically, either during the day, even my clinical patients who come in, they'll say, my depression is worse in the morning, but then, I go to work, and by lunch it's a little better, but then I come home and I'm all alone, and my depression and anxiety are really bad. But the person who tells you that, their symptoms are at the maximum all the time, that they're unrelenting, nothing makes them better, is very unlikely to be true. So based on that, I don't believe that that Mr. Loyd would be suffering from his delusions 24/7, 365, that he's going to have periods where he's better, periods that he's worse. Obviously things like stress, anxiety, any drug use are going to make his symptoms worse. And then periods of stability, when he's happy, things are going well, you can expect that his symptoms will be a little bit better. He'll never be normal, but we're going to see this vacillation of his symptoms.
Okay. So if Mr. Loyd is in a delusional or is in a stressful situation, the likelihood of the delusion playing out is much higher than when he's in the norm.
Right, particularly if it enters that realm, like if he's, if he actually feels like someone is trying to hurt him and harm him, and there's some actual evidence that that's true, because remember, he maintains his beliefs even when there's no evidence, there's nothing going on, but when something in the environment actually, triggers this, and he's like, well, now it almost seems like you're right, well, I've always thought that people are trying to hurt me and harm me, but look at what that person's trying to do, they have a gun, or they have a knife, or they've been following me, so whenever the environment actually reinforces his delusions, you can expect that he's more likely to act upon them.
Now, what is a personality disorder?
A personality disorder, as kind of like as it sounds, is not a major mental illness. Major mental illnesses, I mean schizophrenia, bipolar, major depressive disorder, even panic attacks, etc. So those are major mental illnesses or clinical syndromes. Beneath that, when we have personality disorders, what's someone's personality like? Are you someone who's prone to being histrionic, very dramatic? Are you prone to being paranoid? Are you prone to being grandiose? You have that personality aspect there. And we all have these traits. Like, for instance, narcissism. That gets thrown out. Narcissism. A lot of successful, powerful people have traits of narcissism. In fact, we want that. In Tampa, there's a law firm where the lawyers are doing this commercial, and you don't really know what they're doing. It looks like a men's suit. I mean, they're good-looking men, and then you want a lawyer with a little bit of swagger, don't you? And so we kind of like that in our society. So just because you have traits of a certain personality disorder doesn't mean you have that disorder. So the personality disorder is when those traits get so high, they start to interfere with your life. You can't maintain relationships, you can't maintain a job. People are saying, boy, that person, he's so dramatic, or he's so paranoid, or he's so narcissistic that I can't work with them, I can't live with them, I can't date them, etc. So that's when it gets to be a problem.
And how do you know that this here is not a personality disorder?
Sure. Simply put, the symptoms don't fit. Okay. The types of there's only 3 types of personality disorders that can slip into psychosis: schizoid, schizotypal, and paranoid. He doesn't really have any of those personality disorders. The only qualities that he has because of his grandiosity is some narcissism. Narcissism doesn't involve psychosis. So if your theory was that he's a narcissist, if you will, or has a narcissistic personality disorder, you'd have to say, does that diagnosis cover all of his symptoms? They don't get psychotic. So that wouldn't be explained. Whereas with the diagnosis I selected, the delusional disorder, it covers him being grandiose. So you can see why someone might think he's narcissistic, because he has these grandiose delusions. So in science, we call it Occam's razor or parsimony. You want to keep things simple. So if you can get one diagnosis that encompasses all the symptoms, that's more likely to be right. The psychotic disorder that I did covers all of his symptoms, covers his grandiosity, covers his persecutory delusions or paranoid, covers his psychotic symptoms. It's all in there. If you go down to just a personality disorder, it doesn't explain any of the psychotic symptoms. So you have to do one of 2 things. You either have to say, well, he needs 2 diagnoses. He's either a narcissist and he's psychotic, so now he's got 2 diagnoses, or you have to say that you have to ignore the psychotic symptoms and somehow explain how your diagnosis doesn't include very, very critical symptoms. Obviously, I don't think that's correct.
And so you would disagree if Dr. Pritchard said that was the diagnosis, or mixed personality, or whatever he says in his deposition. You disagree with Dr. Pritchard?
Yes, because it doesn't cover the range of psychotic symptoms that we have from empirical testing. Also, what I didn't see is any testing of a personality disorder. When someone tells me that in a forensic case, particularly when death is on the line, you can test that. We mentioned the testing, the MCMI, the PAI. There's a scale for narcissism. Just like I showed you with the chart, it'll show you with narcissism. Does someone just have some qualities of narcissism? Do they have narcissistic traits? Or wow, do they have a narcissistic personality disorder? So my thing, my students, clinical equals I have no evidence. So I was waiting to see where's the evidence, where's the personality test that shows that he actually has a personality disorder. I didn't see any unless there's more evidence forthcoming. I didn't see any in the deposition.
Did you form impressions in this case?
I did.
And what were your impressions?
Essentially that Mr. Loyd, we'll start Two things, neurology and the psychology of it. Neurology, again, I didn't think he was faking. There's no evidence that he's attempting to malinger or fabricate symptoms of neurological disease or neurological injury. I find him to be free of symptoms of neurological injury or neurological disease at this time. Again, he has suffered head injuries, don't deny that. I don't see any, at this time, that they've caused any lasting problems that I can detect. I do think he has a learning disability. That's consistent with his history, a verbal learning disability. That shows up in the data. In terms of psychiatry, I don't think he's trying to exaggerate or fabricate symptoms of psychiatric illness. He's not trying to malinger. He's not trying to fake bad. And I do think that he suffers from a psychotic thought disorder, specifically a delusional disorder, mixed type with both grandiose and persecutory delusions.
And would you say that that is significant?
Yes, this is the type of disorder that can be significant in a criminal case like this. Individuals who have a psychotic thought disorder don't think like other people. They're likely to misinterpret information or to think differently, particularly when they're paranoid or persecutory. They're likely to do harm to others before they perceive that harm will be done to them. So it's certainly that in a case like this, it's something that should be on our radar, that this could be very important.
If I can have a moment, Judge?
Sure. Cross.
Doctor, you were talking about a clinical diagnosis, and that was your, I don't have the data?
I was talking about just referring to clinical examination.
Okay.
When someone doesn't do any testing and just says, well, I sat with them, I talked with them, and this is my clinical impression.
Okay. Did you, after you met and talked to the defendant in this case, did you come to a clinical impression about him just based on that part of your examination?
Well, I offered a diagnosis, if that's what you mean.
After just the clinical, just your interview with it?
Oh, no.
Testing?
No, all I do after the clinical part is I order what tests are going to be given based on my impression. So I mentioned I thought there was a psychotic disorder, so I ordered the MMPI-2-RF, and then I knew he had a history of multiple closed head injuries, so I ordered the fullest, most comprehensive, full-day neuropsych battery that we could give. And that's all I did.
And you gave I think you said about 50 different tests?
Yeah, I think there was 47 or 48 exactly, almost 50.
And the MMPI was the only one where there were seriously abnormal results?
Right. The neurological, the brunt of the testing was normal, and that I think he does not show evidence of neurological disease or injury.
Would it be fair to say that you don't make it a diagnosis based on a single test result?
Absolutely. We and not just testing. So we aggregate or combine testing with history and records.
So you're going to look at the big picture and coming to that conclusion.
Exactly.
Now the MMPI, you mentioned that the computer scores it and gives you the score, correct?
Right.
It doesn't give you the diagnosis.
No.
You have to come to the diagnosis based on the score and everything else you know.
Right. The diagnosis is for the doctor. The computer doesn't give us that diagnosis.
So even with the MMPI, there's a certain amount of interpretation that has to go into it before you come to your conclusion.
Sure.
You mentioned that the defendant related to you this episode where he had been kidnapped.
Yes.
And his indication to you was that this had lasted for 4 hours,
Yes.
not 2 days.
No, he told us 4 hours.
And prior to the commencement of this trial, you had occasion to participate in a conference call with some of the other professionals on the case.
One other doctor. I spoke to the psychiatrist, Dr. Mayer.
You did not speak to Dr. Dunn.
No.
Doctor, would it be fair to say that most of the work you do is in death penalty cases?
Yes.
And would it be fair to say that most of the work you do is on behalf of defendants?
Yes.
I'm not moving it in, Your Honor. I'm just going to show it to the
Okay.
witness.
No problem.
Doctor, I could quiz you and ask you how many times you've testified in the last 10 years, but you provided us with a list of the cases where you've testified.
Yeah, I think for over 20 years.
Okay. I want to ask you about the last 10 years.
Okay.
And may I approach the witness, Your Honor?
I think I brought it with me, so I don't have to steal yours.
If you have your...
Yeah, I do.
You have it there?
Mhm. You can tell me what page you're looking at so I could get to the same?
18 through 21.
18 to 21. Okay.
You can check my math, my adding, my counting. Fair to say that the last 10 years you've testified in over 100 cases?
Well, I'm not going to, I have the aggregate. I know I've testified for 207. I'll trust that you counted them instead of me sitting here in front of the jury. But yeah, that sounds right.
And of those, you've testified on behalf of the State Attorney's Office 3 times?
I think I told you already, yeah, I testify mostly for the defense, so that wouldn't be surprising.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I have another question.
Redirect.
Doctor, are you hired because you're one of the best?
How do you answer that without sounding narcissistic? I hope so.
Death penalty cases are different.
I get hired because I have two licenses. I'm licensed to practice medicine in Louisiana, and I also work with the Army. So I'm not just the on the witness stand doctor. Actually, I leave in 2 weeks. I can't fly, I'm afraid. So every month I drive 10 hours to Louisiana because they're short of doctors, and I work in a clinic, usually 10 or 12 hours a day, and I see actual patients, prescribe medicine. So I know that that's often useful in cases where defendants are on medication. So I know I get hired because of that, and a lot of psychologists don't have double licensure in medicine. And I get hired because I'm a nerd, and I got board certified 4 times. So pediatrics, I get testified in kid cases, and board certified in adults, I get testified in adult cases, obviously especially in forensics, and I was a professor for a couple of years, so I like to get up and talk and things like that. So I think that's why I get hired. I mean, hopefully, that's useful.
And you had mentioned when you were talking about Dr. Pritchard failing to do testing in this case, you said this is a death penalty case. It deserves that kind of examination.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no whoops in these cases. So, I mean, that's why I kept my 2 postdocs there all day. I mean, if there's anything that we think is wrong, we're gonna do it. We get a cap in these cases, for money, and we've run over the cap many times and not gotten paid for it, because no matter what, you've got to do everything you can, because you can't make a mistake.
Thank you.
All right, may this witness be excused? Thank you, doctor. You are free to go.
Thank you, Judge.
Oh, let's see, you need, Brian. You good? Okay. All right, call your next witness.
Dr. Campbell?
Thanks.
I do.
May inquire.
Have a seat. Thanks, sir.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Would you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
Yeah, my name is Dr. James Campbell. Excuse me. I'm a clinical psychologist. My practice is in Plantation, Florida, which is just outside Fort Lauderdale.
And do you specialize in any kind of particular area of psychology?
Yes, I specialize in trauma, adult survivors of child abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociation, and the associated symptoms.
Okay. Would you explain to the jury your qualifications?
Yes, I have a bachelor's degree I have a bachelor's degree from Colgate University in Hamilton, New York. I did some post-baccalaureate work at Wayne State University, which is in Detroit, Michigan. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology from Nova Southeastern University, which is in Fort Lauderdale. And then I also have a doctorate in clinical psychology from Nova Southeastern University, which is outside Fort Lauderdale.
And how did you become a specialized doctor with trauma?
Well, while I was in graduate school, I studied under a gentleman named Dr. Stephen Gold, who is fairly well renowned, not only in the state of Florida, but nationally speaking, studying trauma, PTSD, dissociation, and specializing in people who've been through experiences that are repetitive. So if you are a victim of child abuse, you don't just get hurt once, you get hurt numerous times over the course of your life and over the course of your childhood. And so that has a different effect on you than somebody who has a healthy childhood and walks into a 7-Eleven one day and happens to be hurt or assaulted. So he worked with other people in the field of trauma to develop kind of a new way of thinking about trauma that involves how complex it is and how once you've been traumatized, you're more vulnerable to being traumatized again. So Dr. Gold and I worked together since 2009, and I still work with him. We're in practice together in Plantation, and he's also the one who got me involved in the forensic situation. So really my training came from working with him, from working in the Miami VA, and also from going on 10 years of experience working not exclusively with trauma, but about, say, 80% of my practice is specific to trauma.
And in the course of your work doing trauma evaluations, is there something known as ACE that is used frequently in your work?
Yes, yeah. The ACEs questionnaire, ACE stands for Adverse Child Experience, ACE. And it is a research study that was done by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, in coordination with a really big hospital out in California called Kaiser Permanente, and they have an insurance company too, and that's really not important. But they followed 17,000 people and did what they call a longitudinal study. So they followed them for about 10 years. And they were granted access to these people, medical records, their life histories. They interviewed them. They did a very extensive study. And what they found was there are 10 specific risk factors that if an individual is tied to or experiences any of these before their 18th birthday, then they're able to predict, not with a level of certainty, but certainly these are risk factors that make them a higher probability that these people will experience not only psychological difficulties, but medical problems, behavioral problems, kind of the whole gamut. They've connected it to a lot of different issues and complications over the course of the person's adult life as well.
Doctor, you get this? Can I have you step down for a moment?
Sure.
Yeah. Doctor, I want you to write out the 10 items that are used in the ACE study, and I want you to talk a little bit about each of them, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the study, okay?
Okay. Can I get my
Sure.
right on?
Sure.
Have them memorized. I apologize. Sure. Absolutely. Just want to make sure the jury visualize the work that you're doing. You want me to hold that for you? You nervous? What's that?
Are you nervous?
I'm a little nervous.
Okay.
But that's all right. I'll go with it.
Now, you said the Center for Disease Control uses this?
They're the ones who actually created it.
Okay, so that's a government agency?
Correct? Yep.
And how do they use it, Doctor?
The idea is that it outlines, like I said, risk factors. So, for example, if you score 5 out of 10 or 6 out of 10 with certain characteristics, they can actually link that statistically to you have a this times higher rate or higher probability of experiencing obesity or alcohol use or heart disease or
So this really applies to all of us in the courtroom.
everything. It applies to everybody in the United States. It's been replicated in 43 states by individual, I don't know what the state level calls it, but the CDC of individual states, they replicated it in 43 states and found similar results, not always perfect.
Okay.
Groups of people across different places. Almost done.
All right.
I agree with you. I'll explain
Okay.
what they all do. Do I have to use the microphone? Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So basically, these are the 10 risk factors. You go through them as it has to be before your 18th birthday for it to qualify. Okay. So first and foremost, were you verbally abused? The question reads, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you would be physically hurt, physically threatened? Number 2 is physical abuse. So did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, throw things at you, ever hit you so hard that you had marks over injured? Number 3 is sexual abuse. Again, did an adult or a person at least 5 years older than you ever touch, fondle, touch you? Have you touched them in a sexual way, attempt to have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Number 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? So again, we're talking here about attachment and emotional kind of connectedness, where you loved and cared for, things of that nature. Or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other. Number 5 is physical neglect. The idea, did you have enough to eat? Did you feel that you were cared for? Were you taken to the doctor in a timely manner? Were your parents too drunk or high to take you to the doctor? Things of that nature. Number 6, it says, were your parents ever separated or divorced? The idea here is, were you raised by a single parent? Were you raised in a tense household where people didn't get along? It kind of factors under a lot of risk factors. Number 7, was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, dragged, slapped, and things thrown at her? A lot of research has shown over the years that for a small child witnessing their parent undergo domestic violence, that's what DV stands for, domestic violence, is considered a traumatic experience. As an adult, you have to, in order to be considered a traumatic experience, you have to feel as though you could be seriously hurt or die. But in this case, for a child, the idea that one of your caregivers, somebody that you're attached to, may die is just as kind of threatening to your own existence. So for a child, especially a small child, witnessing domestic violence is something that qualifies as an important risk factor here. Number 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or used street drugs? So substance abuse is what I abbreviated there. Number 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member ever attempt suicide? So again, not did you as an under 18-year-old have mental illness, but did you live with someone who was suffering from mental illness? I'm sure you guys can all understand how living with someone who is going through a lot of mental illness will put extra stress on the family in general and on the dynamics in the household. And the last one is, did anyone you live with go to jail? The household member ever live with? And those are the 10 factors.
Okay, and so the way it works is that the more factors you have, they have a statistical connection to things like you're going to use drugs yourself, you're going to...
I'll give you guys a couple of examples. So, first of all, if you have a 4 or higher out of 10, you are one of 12% of the respondents to this study. Okay, so we're talking about a small proportion of people that have higher than 4 of these risk factors, right? So if you have a 5 or higher, you are 4 times more likely to use or abuse substances in your life. If you have a 6 or higher, you are 10 times more likely to engage in sexually risky behavior. If you have a 5 or higher, you are 5 times more likely than the person sitting next to you to experience depression at some time during your life. If you have a 6 or higher, your average life expectancy is 26 years old.
And that was all statistical stuff that the CDC collected over a period of time when they were doing the study.
And the beauty of it is that because the CDC did it, it was done with taxpayer dollars, the actual data is available to everyone. So there's been, I don't know if it's not there, new studies coming out every day using the data and analyzing it different ways. There's been a wealth of research on this.
Okay, why don't you grab a seat? And I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm just going to move this a little bit out of the way, but I want the jury still to be able to see this while you're testifying. Put that there. All right, doctor. Did you review materials in this particular case?
I did.
And what materials did you review?
I reviewed Orange County Sheriff's Department investigative report. The author was Detective Savelli. Orange County Public School records, Orange County Sheriff's Office police report from 11/17/2016. Another Orange County police report that related to Mr. Loyd's son that was dated 8/16/2016. A police report for a homicide of Wesley Harp that was dated 1/20/1996. A report by Dr. Joseph Sesta dated 11/2/2018. And I also had a conference call with some of the other experts in this case where we discussed the case.
And did you review what you consider the traumas that you related to this work?
I interviewed Mr. Loyd for 4 hours on the 30th of September and did a background history, spoke to him about his life. One of the things that I do when because I do this forensic work, I also am a clinical psychologist. I have a practice where I sit with people and I try and help them treat their PTSD or their trauma-related symptoms as well. So one of the things that I'm aware of is the fact that if I go into a room and I say, "Nice to meet you, Mr. Loyd, please tell me about all your traumas," that's not really a fair or unbiased way to get the information. So I make sure to go in and I say, "I'm a psychologist, this is what I do, these are the things that I work on, this is what I typically do, today I'm doing something different, let's talk about you. I need to get to know you so that I can present you to the jury and they can get to know you." And through the course of that, the life experiences, and in this case, some of his traumas certainly came out.
And what was the information you obtained from him about the specific traumas?
All right. Well, first and foremost, he had a very difficult childhood. His mother was, from his report, not available. He believed that she was at work. I don't know if she was at work or if she was out doing other things. I don't really know. What I do know is she was not home. He and his older sister, who's 2 years older than him, were in charge of kind of taking care of the younger kids, running the house. He told me a story about being 7 years old and the pantry and the fridge being empty, and he had to go out to try and kind of scrounge or steal or shoplift food to try and feed the kids. Bread, peanut butter and jelly, things like that. He spoke about, his mother beating him extensively when she did get home, using extension cords, belts, switches, basically anything she could kind of get her hands on. And one of the criteria, as he reported to me, was that she wanted to beat him until he cried, until he submitted in some way. And for whatever reason, and I have some theories that we'll talk about later, but he was unable to cry. He did not cry. So some of these beatings lasted for a very long time, to the point where he reported that his mother just got winded and kind of stopped. He spoke as well about some of his experiences, as a young adult in his violent neighborhood. He spoke about one situation in particular where he was standing on a street corner with a friend. Somebody drove by, kind of a classic drive-by shooting that I'm sure we've all seen on TV, and that he fell kind of straight backwards onto the pavement, hoping that they would miss him. And they did in this case, luckily, but they shot someone standing next to him, and then there was, of course, all the chaos and the blood and the ambulances and things of that nature. He spoke about one of his best friends, his cousin, being shot and killed. He spoke about, let me see, I'm flipping through my notes here. He talked about being expelled from school and being home for part of a year. There being no money for Christmas presents, things of that nature. And then we spoke at length about his experiences as kind of a young man. And there's kind of two categories here. There's a situation where he was kidnapped with a couple other men, and then there's the situation that he had that was difficulty when he was working delivering chicken at night in a very dangerous situation. The kidnapping in particular, he was with a couple other friends. They said, hey, keep a lookout down the street, and they went to apparently look inside of a car. Whether they were going to break into the car or steal the car or whatever, he didn't really know. Somebody in the house noticed, brought the kids, the young people into the house, and proceeded to beat them with fists and guns and everything else for what Mr. Loyd recalled was about 4 hours. They were, threatening them. They were yelling at them. They threw them in the trunk of a car. They moved them to the woods. They took away their shoes, and they asked them where they lived, where their mother's houses were, things like that. Basically intimidating them and torturing them psychologically in any way they could. They then told the kids to run into the woods as fast as they could, and they shot either into the air or at the kids. Mr. Loyd didn't know because he didn't look backwards, as the children ran away. And this was a very, obviously a very troubling experience for Mr. Loyd, something that stuck with him. Later in his life, as I said, he was delivering chicken. And apparently this chicken business called the Texas Chicken something, I'm not sure, I don't live locally, so I'm not sure. But he was a delivery driver, and they apparently stay open very late at night. And while Mr. Loyd was delivering for them, first of all, one of the things to remember or to understand is that he told me that this is a very lucrative business. They make a lot of money delivering. Late at night, people don't want to go out. The fact that they'll deliver, these chicken meals or whatever to people at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning is a large business and very appealing. But there were 3 incidents that he reported to me. The first was that one of his coworkers was actually robbed and shot and killed while delivering this chicken. And that Mr. Loyd himself was robbed at gunpoint twice while delivering chicken. The second time in particular, he said, was by a group of young kids. He later the next day reported that he went back to the neighborhood to kind of talk to people and to see what was going on, and an older gentleman in the neighborhood told him that he had talked to the children and told them not to kind of like keep their heads down because, you know, Mr. Loyd was going to come get him or something like that. So, of course, this kind of put Mr. Loyd's radar up. In fact, maybe these people are going to come and try and get me again. Maybe they're going to try and get me before I get them. So there was a lot of anxiety and hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is one of the main criteria for PTSD. It basically means that you're kind of on guard all the time. You're looking, your head's on a swivel. You're always looking over your shoulder. You know, a door closes and you jump. Those sorts of things. And so all of this led to a lot of trauma in his life and a lot of paranoia.
Now, did you evaluate your interview with him and the information you obtained from him in regards to where he fell on the ACE study?
Well, I did give him the ACE study. I read it to him and circled his correlations. So on that questionnaire, he scored a 6 out of 10. Okay? So he answered yes to 6 of the 10 questions. He answered no to 4 of the questions.
Okay, and which 6 of the questions did he answer?
He endorsed question number 1, the verbal abuse, question number 2, the physical abuse, question number 5, the physical neglect, question number 6, the parent separation because his father died when he was 3 years old and was raised by his mother alone. Number 8, the problem drinker or substance abuse user. And question number 9, he didn't actually answer. He basically explained to me that his family does not believe in mental illness. But I was able to speak with some of the other experts, you know, talk to the defense team about some of the records and confirm that there was actually a history of mental illness in his family and that it was largely neglected, and so it kind of blossomed and ran amok. So number 9 was a household member, depressed or mentally ill was the 6th yes.
And what is the relevance of his score on that study?
Well, as I said before with some of the examples, you know, if you have a 6 or more, you have a 10 times higher probability of risky sexual behavior. You have if you have a 5 or higher, you have 4 times more likely to abuse drugs to try and deal with some of your symptoms. You're 5 times more likely to be depressed. Your average life expectancy is 26 years old. These effects, these very stressful, traumatic experiences when you're under the age of 18, they have a profound experience or a profound effect on the way that you see the world that you then go into as an adult.
Did he believe that he would have to look out for his family as opposed to anyone looking out for him?
Yes. When I asked him the question, let me read it to you verbatim. I said, did you often or very often feel that your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? He looked very puzzled and said no, and I asked him I inquired about the puzzled look, and he said I looked out for them. It never even occurred to me that they would look out for me. Like, the idea that they looked out for each other was very foreign to him. He was the protector. He took care of the family. He provided. He was, especially as a younger person, what we would call a parentified child. Basically, the weight of a adult or parent life was put onto a child when they're young and not emotionally developed and prepared to deal with that. And he carried that throughout his life.
Did the abuse by his mother result or not result in the PTSD issue?
Well, according to Mr. Loyd's self-report, he did not think that the beatings by his mother were a factor in his PTSD. He did not report having any nightmares or re-experiencing about the beatings that his mother gave him. And he did not again, report that was a salient issue at this time for him. you know, one of the things that I learned in spending my time with Mr. Loyd is that he has very well in placed and almost entrenched self-defense mechanisms. He has worked very, very hard to, you know, to push his emotions away, to kind of compartmentalize them and repress them, and not, you know, try not to let them come through. I think that he thinks that being emotional is a sign of vulnerability. It's a sign of weakness. And so getting Mr. Loyd to kind of open up and speak about these things took some time. It took some effort.
Did you do something called the detailed assessment of post-traumatic stress?
I did, yes. The detailed. Go ahead.
What is that?
That is a self-report questionnaire, okay? So it's about 140 questions, and you basically, all I kind of do is just introduce it and hand it to the gentleman and ask him to fill it out. It asks you to go through and kind of identify the traumas that you've experienced in your life. It then asks you a series of questions about symptoms that are related to post-traumatic stress disorder, and ask you about the frequency or the intensity of those. And you answer on like a 1 to 5 scale, you know, like with 5 being very much and, you know, 1 being never, and obviously there's what we call a Likert scale. And so you just circle answers as you go through.
And did you grade that, and what were the results?
I did. I graded it. The results showed that according to his self-report and according to the DAPS, Mr. Loyd does experience post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and according to the assessment itself, that he does meet criteria for PTSD.
So when you're going through this process, you collected the history, reviewed the material, you did the ACE study, questionnaire, and ranked him on that, and then you did the detailed assessment of post-traumatic stress questionnaire, and you ranked him on that. And did you come to a conclusion about the post-traumatic stress?
Yeah, in my professional opinion, Mr. Loyd does suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder as outlined by the DSM-5.
And what are the symptoms that someone who is suffering from post-traumatic stress?
Well, there are 5 criteria that you have to meet in order to be diagnosed with PTSD. The first one is exposure to trauma. And as I said before, trauma is defined a little bit differently whether you're an adult or a minor under the age of 18. The second criteria is hypervigilance, which I mentioned earlier. It's a very specific kind of anxiety that involves you know, always feeling as though you're in danger. You know, I describe PTSD to people who've never kind of understood it fully as being on guard, being in survival mode all the time. You know, we all have a fight or flight response inside of us, and whenever we get scared, we get an adrenaline surge, our heart starts to pump, we breathe harder, we're ready to act, whether to defend ourselves or to flee. And when people have been through traumatic experiences, sometimes that system gets a little haywire, it gets a little kind of miscalibrated. And so a couple things happen. Sometimes it can be always on, kind of always, you're always on guard. The other thing that can happen is you can be overly sensitive. You can find and see danger in situations where there aren't danger. And it can make it very hard to relax, very hard to sleep, very hard to let your guard down. It's one of the reasons why in dealing with PTSD, treatment is such an important aspect of it, because you really have to kind of reparent these people on how to control their emotions. The third criteria is something that we call re-experiencing, and I'm sure that all of you have heard of this. This is what everyone refers to as like flashbacks, nightmares, things like that. The current understanding of that is that it's our brain's way of trying to make sense of what happened to us. Basically, we go over the experience over and over again, trying to make sense of it because it's so different than how we think of ourselves, and we have trouble kind of understanding it, labeling it, putting it on a shelf inside our mind. Kind of, you know, our minds are very good at dealing with things that are good and things that are bad, but things that are kind of ambiguous and in the middle and confusing, we have trouble with. It's why they kind of pop up in our minds from time to time. And in this case, these flashbacks and nightmares typically come from what we call triggers. The idea is that something reminds you of a traumatic experience or a horrible experience you were in earlier in your life, and it for a split moment, you feel like you're back there again. You have the heart palpitations, you have the breathing, you have the sweating, all of that. And so those re-experiencing situations can themselves be traumatic. It feels like you're going through it again, even though you're in a completely different place. And to go one step further, the triggers are very specific to each individual person, and they can kind of be anything at all. I've worked with people in the past whose fathers were abusive to them, and when they hear a voice that's deep, like their father's voice, they get triggered. They feel as though their father's in the room. They feel as though they're in danger. My voice is not the deepest one in the world, but it's a little deep, and I've actually lost clinical clients because of that. The next step is, or the next criteria is actually related.
Before we leave
Yes.
re-experiencing, did he have symptoms that you saw with the re-experiencing?
Yes, he did.
And what were they?
Let me look specifically. He spoke about he spoke at length about the what I will call the chicken robberies, the chicken delivery robberies, and the fact that just... Somebody say something?
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. The chicken delivery robberies, that they were very triggering for him, that being in a car at night, being in the neighborhoods where those robberies occurred, even just being outside of his home at night was very triggering for him. It made him feel very uncomfortable, very unsafe. And it would bring him back to that same mentality that he was in when the young men were sticking the gun in the car window and he was handing over the chicken and the phone and the wallets and whatever else he had on him at the time.
Did he say something about the loud noise in the jail?
Yes. Well, that was a trigger for him in terms of a kind of startle response. He said that there's a noise, and anyone who's been inside of a jail knows this noise. It's like an electronic lock on the doors.
1 second, Mr. Longman.
Yeah.
Can you remove the jury, please? We'll be right back with you folks.